There's a photograph sitting inside NASA's public archive that almost nobody has actually looked at closely, not the famous one, not the golden panorama everyone shares. A different one, smaller, darker, broken. It shows almost nothing. Just noise, shadow, and a black gap at the bottom where the data simply stops. Most people assume it's a technical glitch, a corrupted file, something not worth a second glance. It isn't. That image is the last thing a 15-year-old machine ever managed to say to the only species that was listening. And to understand why that matters, you have to go back to the moment everything started falling apart. In the final week of May 2018, something began stirring in the thin, freezing atmosphere of Mars that no one on the ground crew wanted to see. Not a crack in the rover's wheel, not a stuck joint, not the kind of mechanical failure engineers had spent 14 years bracing for. This was bigger than the machine itself. This was the planet turning against it. A dust storm was forming near Mars's southern hemisphere, and at first it looked ordinary. Martian dust storms happen regularly, seasonal disturbances that kick up, swirl, and settle. NASA's teams had watched dozens of them come and go without much concern, but this one didn't settle. It grew. Within days, it stopped behaving like a regional storm and started behaving like something with intent, spreading, thickening, climbing higher into the atmosphere, swallowing landmarks that had been visible from orbit for years. By the middle of June, scientists were no longer describing it as a dust storm. They were calling it a planet-encircling dust event, a phrase reserved for the rarest and most violent atmospheric disasters Mars is capable of producing. Read that again. A dust event large enough and ferocious enough to wrap around an entire world. And somewhere inside that expanding wall of dust, one small, solar-powered rover was sitting exactly where it had been working for weeks. A place called Perseverance Valley, a shallow, sloped system of grooves carved into the inner rim of Endeavour Crater, roughly the length of 2 football fields. Opportunity had been documenting that valley meticulously, piece by piece, capturing image after image to build something the mission team hadn't originally planned, a final, sweeping panorama of the landscape it had spent months examining. Nobody involved in the shoot knew they were filming an ending. To understand why what happened next hit so hard, you need to understand what this machine actually was before the storm ever touched it. Opportunity landed on Mars on January 25, 2004, inside a flat, crater-scarred plane called Meridiani Planum, 3 weeks after its twin rover Spirit touched down on the opposite side of the planet. Both machines were built for one purpose: survive 90 Martian days, roll across a small patch of alien ground, and search for any sign that water had once existed there. 90 days. That was the entire plan. NASA engineers hoped, quietly, privately, that the rovers might last a little longer than expected. Nobody dared to say what a little longer might actually mean. Opportunity didn't last a little longer. It lasted 55 times longer, 15 years. Over 28 miles traveled across some of the most hostile terrain in the solar system: dust, radiation, freezing nights that dropped to negative 40 degrees, sharp volcanic rock, blinding storms, and mechanical joints never designed to survive a single Martian winter, let alone 14 of them. And it wasn't just enduring, it was finding things. Within weeks of landing, Opportunity discovered small spherical mineral deposits nicknamed blueberries scattered across the plain, hematite formations that, on Earth, typically form only in the presence of standing water. It found gypsum veins. It found layered rock structures consistent with ancient lake beds and shifting shorelines. In short, it found the fingerprints of a Mars that had once been wet, warmer, and possibly capable of supporting life. Every discovery rewrote a little more of what humanity understood about the planet next door. This is not chaos. This is what 15 years of quiet, disciplined exploration actually looks like. One machine, alone, methodically proving that Mars used to be a very different place. And this is the mission the dust storm was now closing in on. By June 2018, the storm had stopped being a weather event and had become something closer to an execution. Atmospheric opacity on Mars is measured using a value scientists call tau, essentially how much sunlight can punch through the haze and reach the surface. On a clear Martian day, tau sits somewhere close to 0.5. On June 10, 2018, as the storm reached its peak directly above Opportunity's position, scientists recorded a tau of approximately 10.8. Think about what that number actually means. It wasn't dim, it wasn't hazy. It was darkness so total that scientists calculated only a fraction of a percent of normal sunlight was reaching the ground, somewhere around 1/500th of what Opportunity needed to survive. And Opportunity, remember, had no nuclear power source, no backup generator, no reserve fuel cell buried somewhere in its frame. It ran entirely on sunlight. Solar panels feeding lithium batteries, feeding every system that kept the machine alive, awake, and communicating. Take away the sun, and you don't just slow the rover down, you take away its ability to think. But here's where it gets worse. As the storm thickened, the mission team on Earth didn't panic. They adjusted, the way they had adjusted through 14 years of unexpected crises. They issued commands telling Opportunity to conserve every remaining watt, to enter a low-power hibernation mode, to essentially go quiet and wait the storm out. The same survival tactic that had worked during smaller storms in years past. The hope was straightforward. If Opportunity could just hold on, if its heaters could keep its internal electronics from freezing, if its clock could stay synchronized long enough to know when to listen for Earth's signal again, then when the skies eventually cleared, the rover could simply wake up and resume where it left off. That was the plan. That was the hope everyone on the mission team was quietly holding on to. On June 10th, 2018, the 5,111th Martian day of Opportunity's mission, the rover attempted one final transmission before the dust swallowed the last available sunlight. Completely. It captured an image meant to be sent through its panoramic camera, relayed up to the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, and bounced back down to Earth. The transmission began, and then, partway through, it simply stopped. What arrived on Earth wasn't a completed photograph. It was a partial, corrupted frame, mostly black, speckled with camera noise, the bottom third missing entirely, represented only by empty black pixels where the data should have been. That broken, unfinished image is the one sitting quietly in NASA's archive that almost nobody looks at. It is, technically and officially, the very last piece of data Opportunity ever sent to Earth. But that wasn't quite the final thing the rover actually saw. A few minutes earlier, around 9:33 in the morning, Pacific time, Opportunity had captured two smaller thumbnail images, one from each eye of its camera, aimed directly at where the sun should have been. In both images, there's almost nothing visible except a faint, ghostly dot near the center. A barely there smudge of light struggling to punch through the storm above it. Scientists used those two dim images to calculate the exact opacity of the dust choking the sky. That faint dot was, quite literally, all that remained of Mars's sun as far as Opportunity could perceive it. Those thumbnail images were captured before the final broken transmission, but were never fully sent. Only their small, low-resolution previews made it to Earth. The full versions were lost in the same silence that swallowed everything after. And then Opportunity stopped talking. Completely. For weeks, nobody on the mission team knew whether this was the end or simply another hibernation. Silence had happened before. Storms had happened before. The team had watched Opportunity go dark and come back to life more than once across a decade and a half of operation. So they waited. Through June, through July, through August. The storm, once declared the most intense global dust event observed on Mars in years, began to clear by late summer, and light gradually started returning to the Martian surface. Engineers began sending recovery commands, hoping each transmission might be the one that finally triggered a response. It wasn't. They kept trying, not for days, not for weeks, for months. Between August 2018 and January 2019, NASA's team sent over 1,000 separate recovery commands toward Opportunity's last known coordinates in Perseverance Valley. Some reports would later describe it as more than 835 attempts through official channels alone, with additional efforts pushing the total past 1,000 by the time hope finally ran out. Engineers tried different wake-up strategies, different frequencies, different assumptions about what might have gone wrong internally. A scrambled internal clock, a corrupted flash memory bank, a fault mode nobody had fully modeled. On what would become one of the final nights of active recovery attempts, the team reportedly played a farewell song toward the silent rover as part of their last wake-up sequence, Billie Holiday's I'll Be Seeing You. A quiet, almost ceremonial gesture from a team that had spent a decade and a half treating a machine less like hardware and more like a colleague. There was no response. There was never going to be a response. On February 13th, 2019, NASA formally announced what everyone already suspected, but nobody wanted to confirm out loud. The Opportunity mission was over, complete, finished. Not because the rover failed in the way machines usually fail, not from a broken wheel, not from worn-out batteries, not from the slow decay engineers had actually planned for. It died because the sky itself turned against it, blocking the one resource it could never survive without. And then something strange happened. Something that had nothing to do with engineering and everything to do with grief. 2 days before the official announcement, as word spread that NASA was likely to declare the mission complete, a science journalist named Jacob Margolis posted a short thread describing what he'd learned from mission scientists about Opportunity's final transmission. He wasn't quoting the rover directly. Machines don't send poetry, they send telemetry, numbers, voltage, readings, atmospheric measurements. But in trying to translate that cold, technical data into something a general audience could feel, he wrote a single sentence paraphrasing what two NASA scientists had told him the data essentially meant, "My battery is low and it's getting dark." He never claimed the rover said those exact words. He was translating, not quoting. But here's where everything changes. That single sentence broke free from its original context and began spreading across the internet as though it were a literal, verbatim transmission. All just as though a machine on another planet had somehow spoken in plain English sentences to say goodbye. Major news outlets repeated it as fact. Celebrities shared it. People made t-shirts. At least one person got the phrase permanently tattooed onto their body. Within days, it had accumulated tens of thousands of shares and millions of impressions, becoming one of the most viral, most emotionally charged quotes in the history of space exploration. Read that again. A machine that never spoke a single word in its entire 15-year existence became, in the public imagination, a dying creature whispering its own eulogy. What most people are not fully seeing, even now, is how strange that transformation actually was. Opportunity never had a voice synthesizer. It never had language capability. Every single thing it ever said to Earth was a stream of binary telemetry. Battery voltage, camera exposure values, wheel torque readings, atmospheric opacity numbers. The idea that its final message was a sentence, a farewell, a piece of poetry, was never technically true. NASA itself eventually had to intervene, quietly reaching out to clarify the confusion after being flooded with public questions about the rover's supposed final words. Margolis himself published a follow-up piece admitting the phrase had spiraled far beyond what he'd intended, explaining that it was his own poetic interpretation of technical statements two scientists had given him. Not a transcript, not a translation, not anything close to an actual message from Mars. So here is the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath one of the most beloved space stories of the last decade. The rover never said it was getting dark. It never said its battery was low. It sent numbers. Cold, technical, emotionless numbers. A power reading near zero. An atmospheric opacity measurement so extreme it barely resembled anything the mission team had recorded before. That's it. That's all the message ever was. And yet, and this is the part that should genuinely unsettle you, knowing that doesn't actually make the story less powerful. It relocates the emotion instead of erasing it, because the sadness people felt watching Opportunity go silent was never really about a sentence. It was about 15 years of a small, stubborn machine outperforming every expectation anyone had for it, discovering evidence of ancient oceans on a planet 40 million miles from home, surviving winters it wasn't built to survive, and then finally, quietly, being defeated not by mechanical failure, but by something as simple and as ancient as weather. The poetry people fell in love with wasn't inside the rover. It was inside us. Inside a species that looked at a fading signal from an uncaring machine and needed desperately to believe something on the other end had felt its own ending. Think about what that really means. Humans didn't just lose a rover in February 2019. They lost a symbol they had unconsciously built over 14 years of watching it work. A tiny, four-wheeled explorer that had become, in the public mind, something closer to a companion than a piece of engineering hardware. And when it finally stopped, people, routine work, documentation, science. The rover was simply doing its job, cataloging a rocky outcrop it had spent weeks investigating, mapping the terrain descending from Endeavour Crater's rim down toward the valley floor. Nobody on the mission planned it as a final statement. It only became one because the storm arrived before the sequence could be completed. That's why parts of the panorama remained black and white instead of full color. Opportunity simply ran out of time and sunlight before it could cycle, through the additional color filters needed to finish the image properly. Incomplete, interrupted. Cut off mid-sentence, in a very literal sense. And this is where the two versions of the ending start to collide in a way that says something bigger than either story alone. On one side, there's the golden, technically incomplete panorama. Beautiful, sweeping, full of real scientific value, but stopped short by darkness before it could finish. On the other side, there's the broken, corrupted final transmission, mostly black, full of noise, missing its bottom half entirely. Two images, two endings. One shows a rover still working, still documenting, still trying to finish its job, right up until the moment it physically couldn't. The other shows exactly what the moment of failure looked like from the inside. Static, silence, and an unfinished sentence. Neither image says goodbye. Neither one contains a message, but together they tell you something no viral quote ever could. That Opportunity didn't stop because it gave up. It stopped mid-task. It stopped while still working. 15 years in, 55 times past its expected lifespan, and the very last thing on record shows a machine still trying to finish what it started. What happens after a machine like that goes silent? The answer turns out to be more complicated and more consequential than most people realize. Opportunity's death didn't end its influence. If anything, it deepened it. Every lesson learned from managing a 15-year-old rover through a planetary dust catastrophe fed directly into how NASA engineered its successors. Curiosity, already active on Mars since 2012 and powered by a nuclear generator rather than fragile solar panels, was partly a response to exactly the kind of vulnerability that killed Opportunity. A deliberate decision to remove solar dependency as a single point of failure. And Perseverance, the rover that would later land inside Jezero crater carrying instruments explicitly designed to search for biosignatures, inherited both its engineering lineage and, fittingly, its name from the very valley where Opportunity took its last breath of usable sunlight. Think about that for a second. The valley wasn't just where Opportunity happened to die. It became the namesake for the mission built to succeed it. NASA's own director at the time remarked that he couldn't imagine a more fitting place for the rover to come to rest than somewhere called Perseverance Valley, a detail that reads less like coincidence and more like the universe accidentally writing good copy. But underneath all of that engineering continuity sits a harder, less comfortable question. What does it actually mean when the story people remember about a historic event isn't the true one? Opportunity's real ending, data, telemetry, cold numbers, and interrupted image, was accurate, verified, and quietly extraordinary on its own terms. It didn't need embellishment, it didn't need a fabricated sentence to be moving, and yet a paraphrased tweet outperformed the truth so dramatically that even now, years later, the myth remains far more widely known than the actual sequence of events. That's a pattern. It's the same pattern that shapes how the public understands almost every major event filtered through modern correction arrives. The myth has already become permanent. According to Opportunity Project scientist Abigail Freeman, the honest version of that final message was simple. The rover reported it had no power left, and that was the last contact anyone received. Project manager John Callis added the second half, that the skies had become so dark that essentially no sunlight was getting through at all, turning daytime on Mars into something closer to permanent night. 2 short technical statements. No poetry, no farewell. Just a machine reporting exactly what its sensors detected, right up until it couldn't report anything else. So where does that leave the story now? Somewhere uncomfortable and somewhere unresolved. Opportunity is still there, technically. Its frame hasn't moved. It never crashed, never exploded, never suffered some dramatic mechanical death scientists could point to and say, that's what broke. It simply sits exactly where it stopped, in a valley named after the exact quality that defined its entire mission, covered in dust it could never shake off, waiting for a sun that eventually returned but arrived too late to matter. In a strange, literal sense, nobody has ever actually confirmed Opportunity is dead in any final mechanical way. It's simply gone quiet. Forever, most likely. But forever is a word engineers use carefully because Opportunity had already broken every prediction anyone made about it once before. Turned out to be something a human being wrote, not something the machine transmitted. How much of the emotional weight people attach to space exploration, to distant machines, to silent signals from other worlds, is actually coming from the hardware itself? And how much of it is simply humanity, standing at the edge of what it can reach, quietly writing its own meaning into the silence on the other end, sitting exactly where its last transmission stopped, not speaking, not signaling, not writing poetry about the dark, just waiting, the way it always has, for someone to send the next command.